everyone, and welcome to the Jeff Buller Show. Today I have with me Tony Ulwick. Now, Tony is the founder and CEO of Strategyn, a strategy and investment consulting firm. As the inventor of outcome-driven innovation process, he has successfully implemented it at some of the world's most prominent organisations and across nearly all sectors. Tony is a pioneer of jobs to be done theory, the inventor of the outcome-driven innovation process, and founder of strategy and innovation consulting firm Strategyn. He has applied his ODI process at some of the world's leading companies and across nearly all industries to inform breakthrough innovations, achieving a success rate that is 5 times better than the industry average, and I look forward to hearing more about that. And Philip Kotler calls Tony the Deming of innovation and credits him with bringing predictability to innovation. Published in the Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review, Tony is also the author of bestsellers What Customers Want and Jobs to Be Done, Theory to Practice. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Jeff, thanks so much. It's a pleasure.
So we had a little chat before you came on, Tony, and we were just getting to, I suppose, the heart of what you do. And in the introduction, I used the term predictability. And what we're trying to do today is demystify the science and dark arts of innovation. And basically, Tony has reduced it to a process which makes it much more predictable. So before we do that, Tony, I am intrigued by stories, and I want to know more about what was the call. You did a degree at Rhode Island University, I think it was, and then you went and did an MBA in Florida. Is that correct?
That's right.
So, what got you into this entrepreneur game?
Well, it's a good story. I started working with a fairly large company called IBM, and I spent 10 years there early in my career. And I did start as a manufacturing engineer, putting my mechanical engineering degree to good use. And I worked on a product called the PC Junior. Now, the PC Junior,
Yes. I remember
yes. Uh-oh. Well, so you know where this is going, right? Because the day after that product was introduced, the headlines in the Wall Street Journal read, "The PC Junior is a flop."
Already.
The day after, and I thought, well, that's bad news. That is bad news, and they were right. It was a flop. It took us about a year to to reconcile and come to grips with the fact that that was true. It was $1 billion failure on IBM's part.
Wow.
And at the same time, they were investing in their own operating system that was called OS2. That
Yes.
was another $1 billion error. It was just phenomenal. And this intrigued me, on two fronts. I wondered, how could IBM and all its vast resources make such mistakes? And the second thing that really intrigued me was, how did those people at the Wall Street Journal know the product was a flop the day we introduced it? Like, the thought was, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had known that yesterday? Or better yet, how about if we knew a year ago what metrics they were going to use to judge the value of the product to make their evaluation? And then we could just, build the product around those metrics and get a better result.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as you expand on that thinking, you'd say, well, how about if we can go to customers to figure out what metrics they're going to use to judge the value of our products, and are those metrics stable over time, and can we rely on them to build products around, and so on. So that was the thought. That's what got me intrigued in the idea of innovation, because I always felt like if we knew the metrics people are going to use to judge the value of our products way in advance, we could just build the products to address those metrics, and the headlines would read, "The PC Junior is the greatest thing since sliced bread," right?
Yeah,
So that was the whole.
so I want to leap in a little bit there. So you and I come from a certain generation.
I think the exact same generation within plus or minus 6 months, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we're talking the IBM PC or the world's personal computer revolution back in the 80s. Is that correct?
That is right.
Okay, so I'm going to give a bit of context to my history. I leapt into the middle of that revolution in '84, and we were given computers like the Apple
Yeah.
and also the IBM PC, and then we had the AT. Where did the Junior sit in that framework? And I'm curious. I knew of the Junior, but it's actually had such a brief life. I almost forgot it existed.
I've been trying for all these years to forget that that existed, but it was actually released in 1985, so
Yep.
it was post PC one and AT, so it
Wow.
came after that. Yeah,
So, what did the IBM PC Junior look like? Was it just a floppy disk meant to be a minimal computer product? Is that what it was?
yeah, it was basic, right? It was a very small box. It had what became known as the chiclet keyboard. I have one around my house here somewhere, uh, and because it just felt like little chiclet keys. It was it failed for a number of reasons, but really it failed because it didn't get jobs done that people were trying to get done
Right.
at home, right?
Yeah.
It came with the same software set that people were using for business, right? So, how many people are using VisiCalc, at home? Not too many at that point, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was a I think um, the modern generation had their smartphones and they were born, a lot of them, in the 90s. And the internet is taken as a given. You and I grew up in an area in a time where you were not connected. It was standalone. And we grew up in an era too where there was personal computers. Before that was mainframes that were hidden in air-conditioned rooms and locked behind locked doors and security, and only owned by banks. And IBM predicted that the size of the computer market in the world was like 3 computers, I think was their prediction at the time, or something around that sort of number.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so I think in history, and we've had a bit of history, both of us, is you forget how far we've come. And I think that's what's rather exciting today.
I agree. Yeah, we've come a long way from a technology standpoint. We need to catch up from a understanding of innovation standpoint, though,
Yep.
because there's still so many myths out there. And like you mentioned, trying to demystify innovation has been my goal for 30 plus years, and we're still at it.
Okay. So you observed a problem and a product failure early on in your career. So that obviously you were curious of why IBM had spent two lots of $1 billion on two product failures. In other words, the operating system and the computer.
Yeah.
So what happened over the next few years after that sort of aha moment early on in your career at IBM?
Well, I spent the last 5 years of my IBM career working in product planning. Uh, and it's kind of a term that was popular back then, but you don't see that term used so much anymore. It's generally the role of the product manager to figure out what's the next iteration of a product and lay out the
Yeah.
product roadmap. But in the product planning role, we try to figure out, conceptualize products that we knew would win in the marketplace. Right? That was the goal. And I I started searching for, first off, within IBM, what's the process they use to do that. Clearly, it wasn't very good,
Yeah.
as witnessed by some of the other failures, right? So I started looking around the industries to see, does anyone have a good innovation process? And we looked at all different kinds of tools. We looked at things that were new back then, like conjoint analysis. Hey, I went to see Dr. Paul Green at the Wharton Business School to go talk with him about this new idea of conjoint and how that would help
Yeah.
create more predictability. We were introduced to the voice of the customer that was new at that time, and the House of Quality, QFD. There's a whole series of things that were happening. It was great times. But one thing I recognized very quickly is that there really was no unifying theory of innovation or no end-to-end innovation process that that people could rely on.
Yeah.
So that's when I went back to thinking through, as I mentioned already, what are those metrics people are using to judge the value of our products? Can we know them well in advance? And it was around, I guess it was 1990 timeframe. I
Hmm.
was doing some work for IBM Australia. I'd spent about a month and a half out there,
Oh, did you? Okay.
and maybe it was uh, the excessive amount of caffeine I had during that time frame. But it occurred to me that's when I was first introduced to espressos. I was like, wow, I couldn't have enough.
Did you spend time in a building that looks straight down the harbour bridge?
I did, in
Yeah.
fact. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. I remember that building. In fact, I did an interview there, and they didn't let me into IBM. I applied for a job there, and I think maybe you whispered in there and said, Jeff's not the right sort of fit for you guys." So, because it would have been about, no, that time wasn't. But by the way, that IBM building now is an apartment tower.
Oh, so right. Yeah, it was just I love being there,
Yeah.
and I was just so focused on work, and it finally occurred to me, um, as a manufacturing engineer, uh, uh, the goal of manufacturing, of course, is to produce a predictable output, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's you have to, right? And what you do in that space is you try to figure out what do we have to measure and control to produce a predictable output.
Mm-hmm.
And manufacturing is a process, right?
Yep.
Clearly, it's a process. So if we can figure out what do we have to measure and control along each step of the way to ensure we get a predictable result, um, let's take that same concept and shift it over to customers and say, well, you know what? You heard this quote: "People don't want the quarter-inch drill; they want the quarter-inch hole."
That's
Right?
right. Yeah.
So if they want the quarter-inch hole, that's a process. And
Mm-hmm.
this is what occurred to me. It's like, people are trying to execute a process. They're trying to create a quarter-inch hole. So how about we apply the same thinking we do in manufacturing over to
Product
creating
design.
products?
Yeah.
Because we can say that, well, customers are executing a process. They're trying to create a quarter-inch hole. What if we study the job of whatever they're trying to do,
Getting a hole
right?
done.
Getting a hold on, and break it down step by step and figure out what are their measurable outcomes? How do they measure success as they're going about getting that job done? And that was the breakthrough, because as it turns
Mm.
out, people do buy products to get a job done. And you can break down those jobs into steps, and you can figure out what are the measurable outcomes they use to measure success with getting a job done. And the beauty of this is the jobs that people try to get done are very stable over time. So these metrics they use to measure success are stable over time. Like people listening to music. And people have been listening to music for forever, right? So, but there's a set of metrics people use to judge success, and those metrics don't change over time. What's changing over time are technology and solutions that help them get those jobs done better. So I started thinking of this as more or less as an equation, right? Where you're trying to come up with solutions that address these metrics. And once you knew all the metrics associated with a particular job and you had them in some order, I'll get to that in a second, you can start testing different ideas against that set of metrics to see which ones get the job done best,
Mm-hmm.
right? That makes
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And then the other thing that occurred to me is we can start prioritizing these metrics. And how would you want to prioritize them? Well, the thought was let's figure out which of these are most in need of improvement. In other words, which ones are unmet or underserved. So this led me down the path of integrating a quantitative research method into the equation, where we could figure out of these 50 or 70 outcomes or metrics people are using, which ones are really important and not well satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
So we could do that quantitatively, and lo and behold, we could figure out what are the top unmet needs of customers in a given market. So if we could expose all that up front, we can start brainstorming ideas to develop solutions to get those top unmet needs effectively satisfied.
Yeah. So what is okay? Let's just pause there a little bit. So
Okay.
how do you discover those unmet needs? Because today we have ways of testing it maybe cheaply with even Facebook ads. What are pain points and needs that need to be met? So what were some of the methods you used to unearth those needs if if you see that as being important?
Yeah, well, sure. So, if people are trying to get a job done and they have all these needs associated with getting the job done, the thought was, well, let's capture all of them, right?
Right.
So, how do you capture all the customers' needs? And then we can figure out which are unmet, right?
Yep.
But let's just capture them first. So, the methods we use are just talking with customers. What we do is I ask them to take us on like a slow motion journey of getting their job done. So, for example, we work with surgeons who are performing a surgical procedure, and we just go from beginning to end. Tell us what you're trying to accomplish from the time you make the incision until the time you wrap everything up. And they go step by step on, how they're trying to gain access into the vasculature, and then they're trying to find the pathway to their destination, and then they navigate through there with their tool set, and then they perform whatever procedure they need to, and so on. But they could take you through step by step exactly what they're trying to do, not how they're doing it. So we're not talking about products, but how are they measuring success along each step of the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because to get a job done better, you can get it done faster, more predictably, higher output throughput, just like a manufacturing process, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you improve a manufacturing process? Faster, more predictable, higher output throughput. This is true of any process, right? So what we're doing is we're talking to customers and listening to the process that they're going through and extracting how they're measuring success along each step of the way. A quick example, everyone cooks meals, right? So what are some of the metrics you use to judge how well you cooked a meal? You may say, well, I want to minimize the likelihood of overcooking the meal. That's one metric. I want to minimize the likelihood of undercooking the meal. I want to minimize the time it takes to cook it evenly across the entire dish. I want to minimize the time it takes to clean it up after the meal. You could just start going through the process and saying, how am I measuring success without really getting at what products you're using, right? So we're trying to define everything in problem space before we get over to solution space, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's as if we're trying to define the problem at an extraordinarily granular level so that we can then figure out, well, at this granular level, where are people struggling? And once we know that, then we put the solutions in
Mm-hmm.
place. So, and to further answer your question, Jeff, I like what we call immersion sessions, where we'll sit with one or two or three customers that are really experts in getting the job done, and spend 3 or 4 hours with them
Mm-hmm.
and work with them to define exactly how they think about the job they're trying to get done. We create what we call a job map that we introduced in a 2008 HBR article, and then we work to capture all these measurable outcomes. So it's a tedious process, but
Mm-hmm.
the beauty is once you've done it, you don't have to do it again for years because these needs are stable over time.
And also, it's scalable, isn't it? Once you've done that.
It's very scalable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I love the term I came across recently, um, and it's something that is a little bit of a free range sort of guy rather than a system process guy. Because I initially trained to be an accountant, and I realised I was not designed to be an accountant, which is very process driven, right? And attention to detail. But the term was, a phrase was, um, systems and processes will set you free. And they do, because it becomes predictable and there's a process. So in the last 18 months, 2 years, I've fallen in love with process and systems. And so it becomes much more predictable in terms of what we do, from just even as simple as a process for publishing a podcast, from
sure.
recording to marketing. And there's a whole range of processes in between. That's a product. So, yeah, it's something I really, really have on board with now.
Well, that's a great example because creating a podcast is a job to be done, right?
That's
That's a
right.
job, and you can break that down step by step. And so, what are some of your measurable outcomes? Like, what's one of the more time-consuming aspects of putting a podcast together?
One would be reviewing the transcript, for example. So yes,
And reviewing it for what purpose?
to make sure that it's accurate and we're not saying bad things, or so in other words, is it because we give it to a computer, does it initially,
Yeah.
and
So you
computers do a good job. Yeah,
so you're trying to minimize the time it takes to confirm that the information you're about to state is accurate.
yeah,
All right. So
yeah,
that's one measurable outcome, right?
yep,
And I'm sure if we sat here for hours, I could capture 40 or 50 or 60
yeah,
outcomes from.
yeah.
That's the interview process, basically.
Yeah, and that's great because what I used to one of the reasons I actually bought the podcasting equipment about 4 years before I actually did the podcast, because I realised that basically it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to actually do a podcast, right? Seriously. And it's the truth. It's like, I know there's going to be a lot of work doing this podcast. We're going to do it well. So we launched a podcast with a minimal viable product before we actually turned it into video as well. So we just created minimal, And I, and also too, I think as an entrepreneur, and that's both yourself and I and many others that will be listening to this, is that if you're the one doing all the work, then you are not free. You are actually trapped. And
That-
I think the job to be done needs to make sure that it removes the owner as much as possible, because they're the inspiration, they're the conductor, they should be leading the team, not doing the stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly it. You want to
Yeah,
be able to get the job done predictably, meaning quickly, without variability, without surprises, and have a great result.
yeah, yeah,
And that's true of any job,
yeah,
and that's true of any process. And that's why this approach works so well, because all products are designed to help people get some job done.
yeah,
So, so this concept works across all industries, and we've proven that in practice as well.
yeah. So there's some of the things you've got a process for it, which is 10 points, which I don't think we need to dive into. But what are some of your, so you, let's go back to where you actually started, Strategyn. So you've been at IBM, you've observed a major fuck up, so, like two lots of $1 billion product failures, um, and you started looking at how you could turn innovation of a product into a process. So after IBM, what happened?
Well, once I had that epiphany, if you will, in Australia, and I thought, wow, we if we studied the process people are trying to execute, I attempted to use that thinking at IBM a couple of times, and I left a couple of years later, 1991, and started Strategyn. Um, and it was good timing for me. For IBM, unfortunately, all that played havoc on their business, because IBM at one point had 0% market share before they entered. They went up to 85% market share in the heyday. And
Mm,
by 1991, they were down to about 10% market share.
well,
So they were shedding people left and right. And they were kind enough to pay people to leave, which was pretty much unheard of at that time.
yeah.
But IBM had a no layoff policy. So this was the first time they had to lay people off. And
Mm,
I opted to take that program, which was great. That funded me, funded my startup basically. Uh, so I could then go secure, I quickly secured assignments with Cordis Corporation, with Pratt& and Whitney, and with Allied Signal, which was still around at the time. So
okay.
that got me started, and I've never looked back.
Well, it's almost like was IBM the original venture capital fund?
Yeah, yeah,
Well, they were angel investors and they didn't know it basically back then.
yeah, exactly. It worked out well. I was grateful.
Maybe they should have taken the thousands of people laid off, the bright minds they trained, because IBM had great education and training.
Excellent,
They
superb.
It was like, I think, best in world from what my observation. The salespeople at IBM were incredibly well trained. Um, so, uh, but they laid all these people off. Maybe they should have said, start a business, we'll fund you through this fund, and we'll actually take 50%. I think they could have done all right out of that.
See, they messed that up too, right? See
Yeah,
that?
oh, that's right. They should have turned a problem into an opportunity, but that's okay.
Yeah,
Okay, so you started Strategyn and you started applying your process-driven innovation method.
that's right. Yeah, I started applying it right away. I had clients right away. In fact, one of my first successes was my first client was Cordis Corporation. They make angioplasty balloon products, and they were down to about 1.5% market share. They were struggling. Everyone
Mm,
came in around them and started beating them. So they had one last go at it and said, we need to create products that are going to win in the marketplace. So I approached them with the idea. They hired me. A year and a half later, they introduced 19 new angioplasty balloons, all of which became number one or two in the market, and their market share went up from 1.5% to over 20%.
wow.
And I'd say the other really interesting thing that happened there is that there was one unmet need called minimize the likelihood of restenosis, which is the recurrence of a blockage.
Hmm.
It was off the chart in terms of the way we quantified it. It was very important and very poorly satisfied. And they said, well, we're working on this device called a stent that can do exactly that. So we
Right.
suggested that they double, triple down their resources on that product and get it out to market.
Yep.
They did. They were first to market with that product. That product was a $1 billion product within 2 years.
Wow.
So yeah, their stock went up from, I think it started at about $12 a share. They were acquired by J&J at $108 a share a couple of years later. So
Right.
it was a great story. It was a
Mm.
great story.
Did you get a performance fee?
I did not. No, I still kick myself in the butt for not asking for one. Thanks for rubbing salt into the wound
Oh,
there,
that's
Jeff.
that's okay. That's my job. I'm a good rubber of salt into wounds, including my own sometimes. So it, this is something I've agreed with too. It's like everyone tries to think that, and this is mentioned earlier in our off-air conversation, is that we think that innovation is an aha moment on top of a mountain.
Yeah,
What you've reduced it to is a process driven that's happens in a boardroom or meeting room that's more innovation by doing. And is that correct?
yeah. Well, it is. It's really at a high level. It's very simple. Let's
Yep.
let's understand a problem that the
Yep.
customer's having and understand it in really deep detail,
And then
and
act. Yep.
then come up with solutions that
Yep.
will address that problem. At a
Yep.
high level, that's all we're doing. But you've heard the saying. I think Einstein gets quoted as saying this, that if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend the first 55 minutes defining the problem, and
Yeah.
then the solution will become obvious. It's, and that's exactly the same thing here, right?
Yeah.
The way I like looking at it is, what are the chances that a product team is going to come up with a solution, randomly come up with a solution that addresses the top 20 unmet needs in a market if they don't know what the top 20 unmet needs in the market are?
Yeah.
It's slim to none, right? But
Yeah.
if you could say, hey, these are the top 20 unmet needs in the market, let's go solve them. They'll be crafting solutions in a day that will, help you get the job done significantly better.
Yeah.
And so we're just flipping it around in his head. We're saying, innovation doesn't have to be an ideas first approach. In other words, just like in the lean startup movement, um, you know, they they uh,
Yeah.
they suggest that people hypothesize the market, the needs, and the product all at once, and then
Mm-hmm.
you go do customer discovery and try to find product market fit. But you're iterating on the market, you're iterating on the needs, you're iterating on the product offering all at the same time. So chances of trying to solve that equation are pretty slim.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're suggesting is let's just do this sequentially. Let's go pick a market that we want to go after, like surgeons who are trying to restore blood flow in an artery, or parents who are trying to pass on life lessons to children. If there are groups of people trying to get a job done, right? Once we know that that's a good market, let's go understand all the needs, all the metrics that people use to measure success when getting a job done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now that we know all the needs and which ones are unmet, now let's come up with a product solution that will address at least 15 or 20 of those unmet needs. Because one thing that you did learn, Jeff, is that people aren't going to buy your product if it just gets the job done 1% better or 2% better. It has to be meaningful. And we
Mm-hmm.
put the threshold somewhere in the 15% range. So if you can help someone get a job done 15% better, then they'll often, you know, look to adopt your product or at least give it a chance, right?
Yeah. So what you're sort of saying is that innovation is really not one big aha moment or thought. It's more like meeting 15 unmet needs and putting them all together, and that becomes where innovation really happens. It's the intersection of many unmet needs that are brought together to provide an incredible solution. Would that be a good summation of it?
That's great. I love hearing you say it like that. I've never said it like that. I'm gonna lift that one from you.
That's all right.
But I think that's exactly it. Because it's not just, the aha moment from one idea. One idea usually satisfies one need, right?
That's
That's not
right.
good enough, right?
Yeah.
What you need is ideas that satisfy many unmet needs, and then that goes into a product that gets the job done a lot better,
Yeah.
right? Because when you think about it like this, people buy products to get jobs done. they're not going to switch from their product unless the new product gets the job done a lot better, right?
Yeah,
So
almost an overwhelming. I have to buy this product.
yeah, exactly. It gets it done so much better
Yeah,
that it's worth switching to. It's worth learning the new product. It's worth having to go buy it. It's worth learning how to interface with it. It becomes worth it, right, at
yeah,
that point.
yeah. So if we were to distill the process into a few points, and hopefully I'm putting you maybe a little bit on the spot here. We don't want to do 10 or 12. So you've mentioned some of them along the way, but I'd just like trying to distill it into, I suppose, a pithy few points. Um, how would you describe going from sitting down with a customer? Number one, you're going to sit down with a customer and you're going to look at customers that are already got a process in place and they're very good at it. How would you describe the process as simply as possible to go from meeting unmet needs in a marketplace to coming up with the innovative product that launches?
Yeah. So, oddly, when you hear this, you're going to go, that is very simple
That's
because
what I'm
this
trying to get
process
to you.
is simple.
Yeah.
Because all we're saying is, let's go pick a market. That's the first step.
Mm-hmm.
What market do you want to pursue? Now, most companies are already in markets, so they don't even have to ask the question,
Yep.
should we pursue it? They're already pursuing it. The question for them is, how should you define your market? And again, we're going to define your market as a group of people getting a job done. That's the first step,
Yep.
right? Second step, now that we know that job, what are all your customers' needs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And needs are defined as measurable outcomes. That's captured through qualitative research. Then we ask the question, well, which of these are unmet, right? And by how much? Well, that's where we do a quantitative survey, figure out which needs are unmet and by how much. There's one next step that we haven't talked about yet, and that is we ask the question, are there segments of people with different unmet needs? Now, the reason we ask that is in nearly every market we focus on or have investigated over the years, people don't agree on which needs are unmet, right?
Mm.
There are quite literally segments of people with different unmet needs.
Yep.
So the way we discover them is to segment around the unmet needs,
Right.
to those measurable outcomes, right? Now, companies generally can't do that. This is why they segment markets by demographics, psychographics, attitudes, behaviors, some data that they have, because they can't directly segment around unmet needs, because most companies, there's no agreement what a need is, what the needs are, or which are unmet. So those first four steps I went to find a market, to find the needs, figure out which are unmet, ask the question, are there segments of people with different unmet needs? And with that information, you can do a whole bunch of things downstream. You can better position the products that you already have.
Mm-hmm.
Like when Cordis released when we got their data back, we realized that some of their current products actually address 3 or 4 customer needs better than competing solutions. So we suggested to them that they just message the strengths. That got them from 1.5% to about 4% market share. So even that was a bonus.
So they message too, sorry.
Yeah, they messaged around those unmet outcomes. In other
Right,
words,
with what, marketing messages or surveys or?
well, just in their marketing communications, right? They
Right.
would just say, "Hey, our product is better than others at these is addressing these outcomes. This
Right.
will help you
Okay.
do this faster, more predictably, or
So
so
you're
on."
talking to the unmet needs then.
We're talking to the unmet needs, right?
Okay.
That same set of inputs can be used to improve your current products as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because now you know where the weaknesses are. It can be used to uh, assess holes in the product portfolio, like the
Mm-hmm.
stent was for Cordis Corporation, right? It
Yep.
was a new product that really generated a tremendous amount of new growth.
Yep.
We have companies use the information to make M&A decisions, investment decisions, and R&D investment decisions.
Yep.
Because if they know where people are struggling to get the job done and they can't figure out how to do it now, well, maybe a competitor figured it out. Let's buy them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a new technology coming down the pike that could address it. Let's let the R&D folks figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that the whole company is dependent on understanding the customer's unmet needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once you have all that together, there's alignment across the organization.
Yep.
And this is one of the, we talked with Clive Meanwell, who's the CEO of the medicines company. Well, he was before they got acquired by Novartis. We worked with them for about 5 years on applying outcome-driven innovation at scale. And we asked him, what was the biggest benefit of this approach? And what he said was rather fascinating. He said it brought transparency, it brought discipline, and it brought trust to teams that typically operate in silos.
Yep. Okay.
And so it aligned them around a common understanding of customers and their needs. So it kind of went from, we don't agree on what a need is, to, hey, we agree on what the needs are, which are unmet. We agree that there's segments of people with different unmet needs. Now all we have to debate is, what's the best solution?
Mm-hmm.
He said, that's where you want your folks. That's what you want them debating, right? You don't want them debating the problem. You want them debating the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And that was
Yeah.
the biggest benefit in his eyes.
Yeah. Okay. So, what's some of the you mentioned a few case studies? What's one of your best, I suppose, results and success stories? You might have a couple. So, what would who are they? What companies are they? If you can mention them.
Sure. We've published a number of case studies over the years. A couple of my favorites. One was helping a company called OnTrack enter the electronic evidence discovery market. This was back in the early 2000s, before there was electronic evidence discovery.
What's
And
electronic evidence discovery?
oh, good question. So when uh, when legal teams, when there's a lawsuit within a corporation, the legal teams go conduct discovery, which means they ask each other party for information, and that information is often stored on hard drives. And so
Emails, etc.
all the above, right? So it's going to get all that information and making it usable for the legal teams. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what it's all about.
Okay.
Now, the on-track folks thought they had a leg up in the competition there, because for years they've been in the data recovery business, which allows them to take data off failed hard drives.
Yeah.
So they had great technology to take data off hard drives. So they said, well, let's just apply it to this other market. So they failed at it twice before they reached out and talked to us, and we helped them along. And the reason they failed is they they didn't recognize that they had a new customer. In the data recovery market, their customer is the IT department generally,
Mm-hmm.
and they receive hard drives from them and they take data off them and give them back to them and so on. Well, they thought that was what was happening here. They'd have to go to the IT department, get data off the hard drives, which they would, and then they'd give it back to the IT department. But the IT department then had to go give that information to the legal teams, right?
Yeah.
And then the legal teams had to search through it to try to find
Yeah.
information. And
Right.
they couldn't. It was not searchable, right?
No.
So what we discovered is that in order to get the job done for the legal team, they had to create a solution that would not only extract the data off the hard drive, but make it searchable, because the job to be done was to find information that would support or refute a case.
Mm-hmm.
And once they realized that that was their customer and that was their job, that changed everything. So third time was a charm. They successfully released the product to market. And what I like about this story is that they've led that space for about 15 years.
Right.
And the reason they did is that we discovered all these unmet needs that were in the market. And the first release of the product satisfied maybe half of them. But for the next 10 years, every year they would take the next most unmet needs and work to address them. It was like clockwork, right? They were,
Mm-hmm.
the way I like saying this is, they were on the most efficient path to growth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they were always focused on the next batch of the most unmet needs. And while their competitors were still trying to catch up on the other needs, they kept addressing the next batch of unmet needs and the
Yeah.
next batch. And to me, that was extraordinarily exciting and rewarding, watching them achieve that goal.
So essentially, they continued to succeed because they kept iterating, meeting unmet needs in their product on a continuous basis.
Right. And they knew what they were,
Yep.
back in the early 2000s, and they just worked year after year. They came back to us about 10 years later and said, Tony, I think it's time to refresh our data. We're out. We've satisfied all the needs that you discovered 10 years ago. What do
Right.
we do now? Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's interesting looking at startups as well, and I don't know if you've been involved with startups in terms of helping create products that meet unmet needs.
Yeah.
It sounds like you've been working a lot with companies that are already working in a set market. They're just and they're quite bigger corporations. But I've been involved with startups over time because of the space I've been working in a lot, and interviewed a lot of startup founders and CEOs. Um, and what I've also discovered, there's two things that startups are quite often in a war with, and there's two wars or two battles they're actually fighting. Number one is a technology battle. In other words, they've got to keep iterating a product until it's the best in market. In other words, meeting the most unmet needs of the marketplace. And
Yeah.
number two, it's a market share battle as well. So you've got to be trying, and these are not separate; they're working at the same time. So
Yeah.
the startup is in two battles. Number one, technology, battle, and number two, they're in a market share battle as well, and that's a challenge. So, do you get involved with startups at all, or have?
Yeah, we certainly have. We've worked with a number of startups over the years, and it's exciting. They do have different challenges, but
Yeah.
they have no legacy, which
No, they don't. No trust, no credibility. Yeah. Yeah.
which can be good too,
Yeah.
because they're starting with a clean slate. They don't have they don't have the constraints that big companies have. They're starting from scratch,
Yeah.
so they can create a brand new platform or architect something that's brand new that is out of the box thinking. Same principles work though. What these
Mm.
startups are trying to achieve product market fit, right? And it all starts with a great product. They have to go through the same steps. They have to make sure the market that they're in, that they've chosen, is attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Are there a lot of job executors? Are they underserved? Um, uh, how frequently do people try to get the job done?
Mm-hmm.
We have like 42 questions that we ask to help
Well, okay.
identify if a market is attractive to a particular startup or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they pick the market, then again, let's go uncover the needs, right? Let's
Mm-hmm.
figure which are unmet, and then find segments of people with different unmet needs, and then go target the segment that you want to go after, so that
Mm-hmm.
you're because, like you said, they're in a market share battle. They're not going to win the broad market with their first release. They should go after the most underserved segment.
Right. Okay.
You always hear the term early adopters, and you
Mm-hmm.
say, "Oh, people are early adopters." What we've learned is that there's no such thing as early adopter. It's not like they love technology and they want to adopt technology. What it is that those are the people in the market that are struggling most to get the job done. They're the most
Mm-hmm.
underserved, right? So
Yeah.
we've shown this statistically, and when they're highly underserved, they're willing to go buy a new product or try a new product to get the job done better.
Mm-hmm.
So going after that most underserved segment is usually the fast path to product market fit.
Right. Okay.
So so the segmentation is very helpful in terms of that. Another thing I was going to mention, in startups, they're always looking for their next round of funding. And I tell
Oh
you
yeah.
what, when uh, when the startups, the CEO shows up in at the venture firm, and they show them a plan that says, "Here's why we're going to win. This is the job the customer's trying to get done. Here are their top 20 unmet needs. Here's the one we've addressed. We know they're willing to pay this much more to get the job done.
Mm-hmm.
This is the segment that we're going after. Here's how we want to position to them." And they have all the data that justifies why they're going to win.
Mm-hmm.
That's remarkable, because what they're doing is they're mitigating risk in the minds of the funders, right?
Yeah. And yeah, that's really interesting in the sense that you are revealing a almost a replicable process that can create trust because there's a system behind this. It's not just a crazy idea or something that is just a fly by night type of thing. It's here's a replicable process and system that has been proven to work. Um, and this is why we're going to succeed because we're using proven systems.
Exactly right.
Mm,
If you can convince the investment team that you're going to win, and show them exactly why,
mm,
uh, then they're much more likely to give you that next round.
yeah.
And we've seen that in practice as well. That's one of the top questions we get from startups. Can I use
Mm.
this information to get my next round of funding?
Yeah, and that's look. I've talked to quite a few, and a good mate of mine's been involved with it. He's actually been he's a founder of a startup,
Yeah.
and it's always this. what's your runway? In other words, how many months left of funding do you have?
Yep.
And I've seen it ebb and flow from 12 months to 2 months. And I say to him, I'm going, mate, I don't know how you live on the edge of chaos and destruction and failure. But it's amazing. But the funding, the ramp, um, there's different comfort levels, I think, for different entrepreneurs in terms of what risks they want to live with.
Yeah, well, exactly. All I can say is 2 months runway is not enough. I know that.
It's
It's not
not.
enough.
Yeah,
Uh,
especially with what's happening around the world at the moment, there's going to be a bit more fear and pause, I think, at the moment. So,
yeah.
at any levels.
Well, what we see is that, you know, companies are great at creating products, right? There's
Mm,
so many companies out there creating products. They're just not great at creating the right products. Just
right.
like IBM, just like IBM. They could
Yeah.
invest $1 billion in a product, just not the right product. If
Yeah.
they could only define the correct product, uh, everything else would take care of itself. And that's what we've been focusing on for all these years is doing the right thing. Like, what
Yeah.
is the right product? Only invest in products that you know will win in the market. How do you know they win? Because you can prove in advance that they'll get the job done
Yeah.
15% better or more.
Yeah.
And along these dimensions with that set of features,
Yeah.
right? So that's what it takes.
Okay. So, just to sum things up, or basically hear a bit of your wisdom from what you've learned along the way since you started. And you've been in business nearly 30 years. You've been running a company as the founder. What are the biggest lessons you learned along the way as an entrepreneur, and also lessons that you learned from observing other businesses along the way that you think you could share with our audience just to wrap things up?
Sure. Well, the biggest lesson is pick something you like.
Yeah.
The only reason I've been in the space for 30 years is because I like it. I love it.
Mm.
It's exciting. It's my passion, and that helps overcome a lot of the other obstacles that will stand in your way as you're trying to run and grow a business over a period of time. So
Yeah.
that's certainly the top lesson.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And reason I love it too is because being an entrepreneur is a long journey. It's a marathon.
Yeah.
And if you're doing something you hate just to make money, it's going to be very hard to sustain that passion and energy, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I call that the discover phase. And the discover phase is this beautiful intersection of experience, expertise, and passion that people are, and to launch a product that people are willing to pay for or a service. And I love what you mentioned because that gets to that absolute core of what I believe about being an entrepreneur. Life is too short to do something you hate for the rest of your life just because you want to make a few dollars.
Yeah.
You need to do it because if you can get that switch turned on, that will sustain you for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And so far, so good.
Well, it doesn't mean that you don't evolve what you do, but I certainly think that you've got to discover why you're on this planet as an entrepreneur and as an individual. And if you can discover that, then the rest is a process.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been fun. I'd say for the first 25-ish years or so of this, my goal was to perfect the process. Let's
Yeah,
make sure it works in every situation. So we've done that. And for the next 25 years, what I want to do is to help people install the process and use it.
yeah, yeah,
So to use it as part of their innovation capability programs, as opposed to us doing it for them, teaching
yeah,
people how to do it themselves.
yeah. So maybe the best way to wrap it up then is to tell people where can they find this information to do a bit of self-education about your system. I believe that's a couple of your books plus your website. Where can they
Sure.
go in and discover the fundamental elements of basically the process for getting jobs done? So what are some resources they can use and how can they contact you as well?
Sure. Well, they can contact me at Ulwick, Ulwick, at strategyn.com. So that's easy.
Okay.
There's a number of sources for our information. One is our website at strategyn.com. There's a lot of information in a resource center there.
Yep.
I also have a Medium site where I publish some articles and that
Yep.
site is called jobstobedone.com with
Right.
hyphens. Um, and then we have a a site called jobsbedonebook.com that allows you to download for free the audio version of Jobs Be Done, Theory to Practice, and also an ebook version of that as well.
Okay.
So those are some of the best sources of information to take the next step and get started.
Mm. Well, thank you for your time, Tony. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've just confirmed the evolution of my journey over the last 2 or 3 years, which is processes and systems will set you free and make you successful. So, so if you're not very good at systems, hire someone who is.
Exactly.
And
Just
yeah, yeah,
you don't have to invent the process. Just follow a good process,
yeah.
right?
And
That's what
and
matters.
and I think what I love, what you revealed, is that you had an aha moment, watching a huge failure, learnt from that, and then worked out your own processes and systems that you've turned into reality and helped many businesses along the way. And thank you for sharing your gift with the world, Tony. It's an absolute pleasure.
Jeff, it was my pleasure. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.